Well, welcome everyone to the second lecture in Zen Buddhism in this series to celebrate our 100th anniversary. Our speaker tonight is Thomas Yuho Kirchner. And just to say a little bit about Tom for the record, because this will be on the recording. Tom was born in Maryland, USA in 1949. He went to Japan in 1969 to study at Waseda University in Tokyo, after which he practiced Zen as a lay monk at Shofukuji Monastery under Yamada Mumon Roshi, and following ordination in 1974, he trained at the monasteries of Kenchoji in Kamakura and Keninji in Kyoto for 7 years, and he later obtained an MA in Buddhist Studies at Otani University in Kyoto, and held positions at the Nanzen Institute for Religion and Culture in Nagoya and the International Research Institute for Zen Buddhism in Kyoto. Among his publications are the Record of Linchi, Entangling Vines, a classic collection of Zen koans, and Dialogues in a Dream, The Life and Zen Teaching of Muso Sozeki. And Tom lives at Tenryuji in Kyoto. Thank you so much, Tom. Tom's come from Japan, and he's just spending a week here to give these lectures. So, Tom, thank you so much for coming. And tonight we're looking at Christianity and what it can give. I think this is a really important subject, because regardless of whether we actually are Christians or have been Christians or are converts from Christianity, we live in a Christian culture, and so therefore, we're informed in every kind of conceivable unconscious way, as well as conscious. It informs the way we look at the world. And so when we, come to study another religion, particularly one that has this is what Tom, I'm sure, will go into, but has a slightly different orientation, it's good to look at these things in depth. And Tom will be doing this tonight. So thank you all. Thank you so much, Tom.
Well, okay, I would like to start this time, not end with a recitation of the four vows, but begin with a recitation of the four vows. So, without further ado, Namo Amida Butsu. Shijo muhen seigan dobon no mujin seigan dan homon muryo seigan gakua tsudo mujo seigan jo shijo muhen seigan dobon no mujin seigan dan homon muryo seigan agubutsudo mujo seigan jo shujo muen seigan dobon no mujin seigan dan homon muryo Gangaku butsudo mujo seigan jo. Okay, I'd like to start with just a few comments about how it was that a Buddhist monk would want to talk about something like what might Christianity have to offer Zen. A number of years ago, already maybe 15 years ago, a group from a dormitory for students of philosophy at Heidelberg University visited Japan. And through some connection that I never figured out, they came to Tenryuji and they asked to have a talk on what Zen is trying to do and how do we practice it. So as basically the only English speaker at Tenryuji, I was asked to do that. Following that, I think sometime during the same year, a few months later, I got an invitation from that dormitory, which conducts, as long as, together with offering facilities for students of theology, they also conduct study gatherings, apparently. So this was precisely what they asked me to speak about. I was a little surprised. I mean, why would they ask a Zen monk to speak about what Christianity might offer Zen? I mean, usually it's the other way around. When a Christian group asks the Zen monk to speak, it's, what could Zen offer us? But they actually asked that particular topic to a Trappist monk who has practiced Zen for many, many years. Actually, one of the most practiced Zen teachers I know, a fellow named Jeff Boekmans. And they asked me, the Zen monk, to speak on this topic. But thinking about it, I don't know, I thought it was pretty interesting, actually. I mean, I can understand why Christians would be interested in what it is about Christianity in particular that might interest other religions. Plus, they probably thought that I might benefit from knowing a little bit more or thinking a little bit more about what Zen Christianity has to offer. So anyway, it's a subject, I'll talk about this a bit later in my talk, that has interested me for some time. So I rather enjoyed preparing for this. This evening's topic, of course, again, is the possibility of beneficial influences of Christianity on Zen practice, particularly in the West, is what I'm going to end up talking about, for reasons I'll discuss later. But I'd like to start by emphasizing that even though we talk about Zen, Zen is by no means a single unified tradition. Even in its home territory of East Asia, it has a number of variations. Back in high school, when I was first introduced to Zen through the readings of D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts and all of the other early writers on Zen, I was left with the impression, basically, that Zen is pretty much defined by the Japanese Rinzai style of monastic practice and koan work. But later, after arriving in Japan, I gradually became aware of this separate tradition of Soto Zen, which has a quite different view of what practice means. And still later, I found out about Obaku Zen, which is a much more culturally Chinese form of Rinzai Zen that came to Japan in the 16th century, several hundred years after the initial introduction of Rinzai Zen to Japan in the late 12th and 13th centuries. So even though now, in its Zen teachings, it follows just standard, ordinary Japanese Rinzai Hakuin Zen, it has kept a very, very different 16th century Chinese monastic lifestyle. In addition, I've also had the opportunity to make, unfortunately, short visits to Korea and Taiwan and stay briefly in Buddhist monasteries there. And although these temples are all, at least nominally, of the Rinzai Zen school, I was struck by the differences in the monastic life in these various countries. For example, in Korean Zen temples, there was less emphasis than in Japan on physical labor, what we call samu. There also seemed to be a greater emphasis on zazen, although with a kind of a much more relaxed atmosphere in the meditation hall than in Japanese meditation halls, which tend to be very, very strict, and you can almost cut the tension with a knife. Also, it intrigued me that the overall atmosphere at the monastery seemed a lot more fraternal than in Japanese Zen. I think there's reasons for this, but I noticed that, for example, at the monastery Songwansa in southern Korea, the meals were an occasion for the monks to sort of cheerfully socialize with each other and, laugh and think over incidents of the day, rather than being, a kind of a strict extension of practice with etiquette and silent, fast as possible eating. Also small details, lifestyle details. For example, in Japan, it seems to be regarded as very important that socks never be worn in the meditation hall, even in the dead of winter. So I go over to Korea and I find out in Korea, the monks are required to wear socks, even in the hottest part of the summer. Taiwan was also interesting in different ways. For example, they seem to emphasize more than meditation study. There's a great interest in study, except the only exception, I saw on my very brief stay there, was Dharma drum, which is a tradition that was founded by the Zen master Shen Yang. But Shen Yang did most of his practice actually in Japan. So I think he was strongly influenced by the Japanese Rinzai style of practice. Also in Taiwan, there is much more, in Buddhism in general, an emphasis on social engagement. For example, they run a lot of hospitals, schools. There was a big earthquake in Taiwan, I heard, in 1995. And the first groups that were there, before the government was, starting to do anything, were Buddhist groups. And interestingly, Buddhist groups run by Buddhist nuns. The nuns are very, very influential in Taiwan. I heard there's something like 3 nuns for every monk in Taiwan. Also interesting was the temples have pretty much become permanent residential communities, at least the larger temples, similar in some ways to Christian monasteries. This is really in contrast to Japan, where the monasteries are just training halls, and the monks are required to leave when they finish their training. I think all of these respective systems have their strong points, and I was impressed by the sincerity that I saw in many of the monastics I met in both Korea and Taiwan. So my point is not to make any value judgments, but simply to point out that there's no kind of set standard Zen monastic life as such. Zen practice takes different forms according to the culture it's in. It's always been that way. As I'm sure you all know, Zen itself is originally a product of the contact between Indian Buddhism and Chinese culture and spirituality. And the final result was a form of Buddhist practice that's quite different than it was in India. Just one example of this is the emphasis on work in Chinese and Japanese Zen. Indian Buddhism, I think in common with many strains of Indian spirituality, particularly world leaver spirituality, the holy person, the monks and nuns, they're forbidden from engaging in physical work. The idea being that work, I believe the word for work in the Indian languages is karma, but it's considered to be a karma-generating activity. And one of the big points in the whole concept of moksha, of liberation, in the Indian religions is an escape from the forces of karma so that we can escape from the world of samsara. But in China, the attitudes toward work are much different. There's this ideal, for example, of the retired Confucian official, scholar official, who retires to the countryside and spends his time, tending a vegetable garden when the weather's good and writing poetry and meditating, in his free time when it's raining. In Chinese Buddhism, work, because of this different worldview, it came to be regarded as actually an ennobling activity, something that can significantly and meaningfully contribute to the life of Zen practice. And something that is also important for bringing the fruits of meditation into the everyday world of activity. So, just as there are Chinese expressions of Zen, Korean expressions of Zen, and Japanese expressions of Zen, I think there will inevitably arise distinctive Western forms of Zen, and those forms will inevitably be shaped by the predominant spiritual culture here in the various countries of the West. Christianity is certainly not the only spiritual tradition in the West, But as the predominant tradition, I think it will inevitably influence the way that Zen develops here. Before I really get into these subjects, though, I'd like to emphasize several more points. First, when I ask, what might Christianity have to offer Zen? I think it's important to keep in mind exactly what kind of tradition Zen, or to remind ourselves maybe exactly what kind of tradition Zen is within Buddhism as a whole. I mean, the word Zen actually means meditation, so that the Zen school of Buddhism means the meditation school of Buddhism. It's the tradition of Buddhism that primarily emphasizes the practice of meditation as a means of realizing the central goal of Buddhism, which is resolving the question of human suffering. How do we deal with suffering in a way that contributes to our growth as human beings rather than tears it down? Why do we human beings suffer, and what can we do about it? So in other words, Zen is, to put it in Christian terms, a contemplative tradition. Thus, a meaningful discussion of Christianity's possible contributions to Zen must, I think, be a discussion of Christianity's possible contributions to the Buddhist contemplative path, which is Zen. And though I keep mentioning the word Christianity, I would like to say here that what I'm primarily referring to is those Christian traditions that are most closely related to Zen. In other words, the contemplative traditions. Those traditions, maybe I should say, that have a contemplative way. So what I'll be referring to, I think, applies mostly to like Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church. The second point, when I ask this question, what might Christianity have to offer Zen, is the issue more specifically of what might Christianity have to offer Zen in the West, as I mentioned earlier. This is a rather different issue, I think, from what Christianity might have to offer Zen in Asia. I was once asked why, although there's this significant interest in Zen among many Western Christians, particularly Christians interested in the meditative way, it seems to be a one-way street. There's not much corresponding interest in Christianity among Asian Zen Buddhists. Now, I've noticed the same thing, and I think it's related to what exactly it is about Zen that interests Christian contemplatives. In many ways, the original meditation practices of Zen and Christianity are very similar. Both involve emptying the mind of images in the understanding that, our limited human thought, the thought process, limited thought process, human process, cannot grasp the reality of the absolute, that it is only through a process of emptying, which Christianity calls kenosis, that it's only through kenosis that we can ever come into accord with the absolute. However, in Western Christianity, this tradition of emptying prayer was largely lost during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, whereas in Zen it was always remained, quite central. I think, there was a lot of abuse, monastic abuse during the Middle Ages, and it was kind of a case of, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But at any rate, Christian monastics have, recently, about a half century ago, started becoming interested in Zen for that reason. And also, I think, Zen meditation has been deepened by an understanding of the role that the body, in other words, posture, breathing, physical relaxation, other things, for example, Zen has been deepened by an understanding of the role that these physical aspects can play in the practice of meditation and in the spiritual life as a whole. This bodily aspect of Buddhist meditation is something that a lot of Christian contemplatives have told me particularly interests them, because there has tended to be a separation of the body and the spirit, in Western spirituality, where the body is regarded as getting in the way of spiritual practice, not as aiding it. Well, Christian contemplatives, again, I think, to repeat myself, are interested in Zen primarily because they see in its meditation a way to recover their own very similar but now lost contemplative practices. The influence of Zen on Christianity, in other words, has been largely, I think, to a great extent, in the area of practice. When it comes to doctrine and ritual, however, these are qualitatively different things in the two religions, in Zen and Christianity. And I don't think there's much mutual influence possible without changing the basic thought systems of the two traditions. And I don't think that's going to happen. Both Asian Buddhism and Western Christianity have their own traditions of ritual and doctrine that have served them well, over the millennia. So I think despite the congenial dialogue that has occurred between the two traditions, I don't expect much influences at the level of, doctrine or ritual to ever occur. However, this is largely concerned with Asian Zen. When it comes to Western Zen, as opposed to Asian Zen, I think the situation is rather different. By Western Zen, I mean the Zen practiced in the West by people who identify themselves primarily as Buddhists, as opposed to people who still strongly identify with Christianity, but find Zen meditation to be a helpful part of their own spiritual life. Westerners who identify themselves primarily as Buddhists are generally interested not only in the meditative practices of various types, but are often, also quite interested in Buddhist thought, and they often look to Buddhist concepts to give structure to their spiritual lives. At the same time, though, as Dr. Biedolf has said, most of us, have had either Christian upbringings or have at least been strongly influenced by the Christian concepts that are part of our Western culture. Often these Christian influences have been rejected at some point in our lives, but the imprint, it still remains there. My own story is pretty much in this pattern. I was raised as a Roman Catholic, with the whole thing. Communication, Saturday confession, Sunday Mass, weekly religious instruction from the nuns. But, of course, later came the usual adolescent questions about relationships and careers and the meaning of life. And at the time, I was first interested in psychology, briefly and not too deeply. But again, after taking a few courses in psychology in college, I sort of came to maybe an overly hasty conclusion that, well, certainly probably more true of psychology at that time. It's very good at identifying the problems and the pathologies, but not so good at sort of addressing, well, how do you become normal? That's what I was interested in. And turning to religion, Christianity didn't seem to offer me any path to that search for meaning that I had, since I saw it as requiring faith in the Christian belief system. And it was precisely this kind of faith that I couldn't feel. I mean, what I did feel was a lot of doubt and not much of an idea of how to resolve this. So when I first read about Zen in high school, the class counterculturist gave me, I think it was a D.T. Suzuki book, actually, maybe Alan Watts. Anyway, it seemed that Zen seemed to offer a way out of this. For one thing, what interested me particularly is that it provided a clear-cut method of practice, something that I could actually do with my body and mind, and that promised a kind of experiential understanding of what religion is all about, rather than just a system of belief that I had to accept or not. Moreover, Zen actually welcomed the kind of questioning and doubt that I had. You know, the proverbial crisis of faith that seems so terrible to so many people in Christianity. Well, this is actually welcomed in Zen. I mean, the attitude is, if you doubt and question, then by all means doubt and question, but go all the way with the doubting and questioning and see what's left in the end. So it was with these things in mind. Also, as I mentioned in my previous talk, some fortunate encounters with some very good Zen people in the States. It was these things, in mind that I went to Japan and began my Zen practice. As the years passed, however, my ideas about the practice changed. Of course, as our ideas about all new things change. Many things that I had thought of as being, uniquely Zen seemed more like Buddhist expressions of insights found in all contemplative traditions, including Christianity. So I started reading books on Christian contemplative prayer and the Christian mystics. And I was introduced, interestingly, by a Zen master to a German Jesuit priest named Father Hugo Enomiya Lassalle, who lived from 1898 to 1990, but most of his life spent in Japan as a missionary. But he was a practitioner of Zen Buddhism. He had been in Hiroshima before World War II and was actually a survivor of the atomic bomb attack on that city. But prior to that, he had already started practice of Zen. He was interested in it, he said, during the 1930s in order to better understand Japanese culture. I mean, at least that's the way he justified his interest in Zen to the church authorities. I suspect his interest in Zen practice actually went a good bit deeper than that. In any event, he was really one of the most impressive people I've ever met. He was utterly unpretentious, and he had this very natural, and I can only say kind of grounded sense of spirituality. And it was largely owing to his influence. He started going back and forth between Japan and primarily Europe, I think during the 60s and 1970s. It's largely through his influence that Christians particularly Catholics in Europe, started practicing Zen meditation more, and that the Vatican ultimately, he was silenced at first by the Vatican, but they ultimately, I think, through the influence of his personality and obvious honesty and sincerity, the Vatican ultimately accepted the notion of Zen retreats being held even in Trappist monasteries. So all of this prompted in me a lot of thought on the subject of my talk today, the possible contributions of Christianity to Zen. In considering these possible contributions, again, I should say at the outset that I believe these contributions are not a matter of Christianity offering Zen something that Zen entirely lacks. I think it's more a matter of a kind of different approach to expressing the truths that are already common to both traditions, but are maybe more often sort of implicit in Zen rather than expressed in Zen. So for this reason, I think the ways in which Christianity or Judaism, or even, the modern Western religion of science, have expressed or dealt with these basic spiritual needs, can have much to offer Western, Zen practitioners in the way of, accessibility or inspiration. I think, gotten the impression again over the years that the Japanese are inspired by different things than Westerners are. You go to a Zen monastery in Japan, and it's very common to hear, in his pep talk prior to the week retreats called sessions, the Zen master say something like, if you people aren't willing to die in this retreat, it's no use doing it at all. And our reaction, well, my reaction is sort of, don't know if I'm ready to die yet, but anyway, this seems to fire the Japanese up. It's a kind of a negative approach, I would tend to characterize it as, but I think we Westerners are actually more inspired by a sort of a more positive take. The Zen teacher that I mentioned a couple times in my talk last week, and I'll mention again a couple times in this talk, Shinzen Young, he put it in a way that I found very amusing. He's very, very interested in the study of mathematics. So he says, in contrast to the approach the Zen masters in Japan take, he said, the way I express it is, before the retreat, I tell the retreatants, okay, you people, you're new to this practice. Any of you that are new to this practice and you can't manage any more than even a 1% effort, keep in mind that even 1% is infinitely more than nothing. And people are generally encouraged enough by that they end up giving 50%, which is probably all that the Japanese master was aiming for anyway, with most of the people that were attending. So, a different directionality, if I can put it that way. Anyway, I think this matter of differences in expression can be the case for some quite fundamental issues that I'll take up later. But I think it can also, be simply a matter of how a certain concept is expressed. For example, as in mindfulness, Zen places great emphasis on being in the present moment. There's a lot of talk about what they call narikiru, being one with pulling weeds, washing dishes, whatever you're doing. The right here, the right now. But I've never heard in Zen a real explanation for this. It doesn't like to explain much. And this teaching of, narikiru, right here, right now, it can remain on a kind of a rather abstract level. Contemplative Christianity, perhaps not unexpectedly, has this same emphasis on being in the present moment. But it puts it into more concrete terms that, in my experience, often resonate more deeply with Westerners. Contemplative Catholic orders often speak of a concept known as a sacrament of the present moment. A sacrament being, of course, anything that brings us closer to God, like, baptism or marriage is a sacrament. My Christian monastic friends tell me that the present moment is considered a sacrament because it's only in the present moment that God can manifest in our lives, they say. The past is, it's a creation of our memory. The future is just our past experience being projected onto what is likely to happen in the future. So these are not realities. For Catholic monasticism, being right here, right now is emphasized as a kind of a way to give the divine, the way to give the transcendent, maximum opportunity to manifest in our lives. There's a kind of a Buddhist joke. Enlightenment is an accident, but meditation makes you accident prone. Meditation essentially being about completely open to the present moment. There's even a scientific explanation for this being in the present moment. I think I probably know a good bit less about modern physics than a lot of you here, so if I'm just spouting nonsense, please correct me. But I mentioned in my last talk about how the concept of impermanence, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, relates to this view that impermanence is a process of constant change, and that nothing is ever in an unchanging state, even for the briefest moment of time. Everything is like in a constant state of flux. And I also mentioned that after this, I gave a talk that described this Buddhist view of impermanence, after which an elderly gentleman came up and identified himself as a retired quantum physicist and said he was quite intrigued by this Buddhist concept of impermanence because in quantum physics, well, in modern physics, they've found that subatomic particles are extremely hard to research because they're never actually there. They're sort of always winking in and out of existence, that they're energy. So that impermanence, this concept of impermanence, is not just about things disappearing or being destroyed. It's about them being created as well. So the implication is that the creative process, when we get down to the very fabric of the universe and everything that looks so solid to us, everything is in the process of creation in the present moment, each and every moment. Creation is an ongoing process in the right here and right now. So in effect, if meditation is, which I feel it is, an ever-opening and deepening process of being completely open to and accepting of the present moment, we are in effect approaching the process of creation. And this is actually one of the definitions of enlightenment I've heard. It's a reconnection with the creative consciousness. This particular physicist voiced an opinion that I heard is not universal in physics by any means, but he said, we have approached the point in modern physics where it is very hard to conceive of the universe being the way it is without an underlying consciousness. So anyway, very, very interesting to me. Moving on, I think another issue where contemplative Christianity might have something to offer Zen in the West is in the validation of a purely contemplative practice. Now, of course, as the meditation school of Buddhism, Zen hardly needs to have the practice of meditation validated. And, this is as true of Zen in the West as it is of Zen in Asia. But I do sense a certain shift in the center of gravity in Western Zen toward more of an emphasis on action in the world. I think, as opposed to just a purely spiritual practice. Now, I do want to say first that, I don't wish to criticize engaged Buddhism or any of the other movements in Buddhism, modern Western Buddhism, that seek to get Buddhism more involved in the problems of the world. I think, Zen practitioners with a vocation for such activity are doing very, very important work. And I think everyone recognizes this is a quite significant development in Western Zen practice. But what concerns me is that there seems to be, when this attitude goes too far, a certain prioritizing of social action over meditative practice. For example, to mention Shinzen Young again, he's taught meditation tirelessly for decades. And even in all of his retreats, at the end of the retreat, he says, anyone who has done one retreat with me, if you ever run into a problem, if you're ever suffering and you really need someone to talk to, you can call me up any time of the day or night. And I actually like the calls that come to me at 3 a.m. in the morning because they always involve the most interesting problems. This is a person, he's focused on meditative practice and has given his all to it, I think, as this makes obvious. And yet, I've heard him criticized by at least one person because he's not doing like soup kitchen type of work. Now, I'm positive that Shinzen would never claim that what he's doing is any more important than soup kitchen work. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's not less important either. Shinzen is helping suffering people and, in a way that very, very few people are capable of. The reason I mentioned this in the context of a talk on Zen and Christianity, I think that many people feel that this impetus in Western Zen toward more social activism is rooted in the Western Christian ethic, or stress on the importance of good works, like caring for the sick and visiting those in prison and so on. I mean, it's important to remember, therefore, I think, that Christianity, though it does, indeed place great value on good works, equally values prayer and contemplation. Again, I'm referring primarily to the Catholic Church here. To elaborate a little bit on this, on the one hand, you have, the church is basically divided into two, if you're going to divide it into two basic directions, there are the active orders. These are people that are constantly involved in activity. These are the people that are visiting the sick, manning the hospitals, etc. But I remember once when I was doing a retreat at a Catholic monastery, a contemplative monastery in California. As I worked in the garden one day, I had a chance to speak briefly to one of the other retreatants. He was a Catholic priest that was in one of these active orders. And he told me that his order required all of its priests to attend a 10-day meditation retreat once every year. So I kind of commented, that he must find this a welcome break from all the busyness and stress of his usual schedule. And he replied, "Are you kidding? It's the hardest 10 days of my entire year. The inactivity drives me crazy." So there are people with that personality. And of course, these are the people that thrive in the active orders. But in contrast to these active orders, of course, you have groups in the contemplative orders. I think the ultimate expression of the contemplative vocation is the Carthusians, who in their communities live basically as silent hermits. They each have, it's kind of organized in a square around a central area, but the walls of these squares are little dwellings. Well, quite large dwellings, fairly sizable dwellings, considering that only one hermit lives in each dwelling. They each have this basically it's a small house with a room that serves as a workshop, another room where the monk prays, eats, and sleeps, and also they have a garden. It's enclosed within the walls of their little, basically it serves as a very large cell for them. They can, grow flowers or grow vegetables or, use as they wish. They do live in a community, but they have absolutely no contact with each other, except during chapel services, and they also take weekly walks, maybe monthly walks, I'm not sure, during which, they can talk to each other and socialize. Their lives, basically, are devoted entirely to prayer and contemplation. There's no provision whatsoever for activity in the world. I mean, the Trappists, for example, the ordinary Catholic, followers can come to the church and participate with the Trappists in Mass. And many of them, I've heard, find this much more meaningful than their parish church, but the Carthusians don't even do that. Yet the Catholic Church regards the Carthusian vocation as the highest of all vocations. Now, the reason is that in the Catholic Church, the prayer of any given individual is thought to affect not only that individual, but every other member of the body of the church. Thus, the prayer and example of the contemplative monk or nun is not limited to that particular individual, but in effect spreads out from the monastery and infuses the entire body of the church. This concept of prayer not being an individual thing, this has implications that I want to go into a lot more in my talk tomorrow. So for the moment, I'll leave it at that. I think the next Christian concept that I believe that has something really to offer Western followers of Buddhism is the concept of grace. Grace in the Christian sense is, of course, a divine act from above, a freely given gift of God offered to people independently of their own effort or even worthiness to receive it. Now, at first glance, it might seem that Buddhism, as a non-theistic religion, would have no place for the concept of grace. I mean, after all, who or what would be doing the giving? And Zen, I must say, Zen as a tradition usually regarded as espousing self-power would in particular seem to regard grace as unnecessary. And in fact, I mean, through my years of reading Zen stuff, there is in Zen a very real tendency to ignore grace as an aspect of spirituality. There is that, I would like to say, this aspect of Zen. Many Zen writings I've seen, they quite clearly encourage attempts to force the experience of enlightenment through effort and strain. And I think this often leads Zen practitioners, both Western and Japanese, to misconstrue meditation as a matter of forcibly suppressing thought to generate extraordinary states of mind. Now, I don't want to dismiss any approach, across the board. I think this certain amount of strain actually, for some people, certain personalities, can, it can yield results. I think particularly in the early stages of practice, but in the long term, just observing the people I've practiced with, I've seen that far too many times the result of this kind of practice is burnout, frustration, and eventual abandonment of the practice. I mean, I think I myself wasted countless hours in the monastery by doing precisely this type of meditation. So I think that, an openness to Christianity's message on the role of grace in the spiritual life might really help Western practitioners of Zen not only avoid such dangers, but also see that the concept of grace is actually quite in line with Zen spirituality. For example, there are passages in classical, very orthodox Zen writings that definitely point to what can only be identified as the concept of grace. One of the most famous of these passages is in the Shoji chapter of Dogen's Shobogenzo. He writes in translation, "Just letting go of body and mind and forgetting them both, throw yourself into the house of Buddha. When you allow yourself to be acted upon from the side of the Buddha, then, with no strength needed and no thought expended, you are freed from birth and death and become a Buddha." I mean, this is just grace. What else could it possibly be? Another example, actually, is a short poem from the great 20th century Zen master, Dr. Vidolf mentioned, Yamada Mumon Roshi. And he was a very orthodox Rinzai Zen master, in the samurai mold to some extent, although he was very much a scholarly man. But as a young person, he suffered greatly from tuberculosis, almost died from it apparently, started spiritual practice for that reason. And after his first breakthrough experience, spiritual awakening, he was inspired to write a poem, which in Japanese is read, "Oi naru mono ni idakare aru koto, kisa fuku kaze no suzusha ni shiru," which I translate as, "That I am embraced by something vast, I know by the coolness of this morning's breeze." This is a poem that is often quoted by my own Zen teacher, Harada Shodo Roshi, who is a successor of Imada Mumon Roshi. Now, Harada Roshi, again, is a tough as nails, samurai-style Rinzai master. But in addition to his love of this poem, he often talks about what in Japanese is called makaseru. This is learning to entrust or surrender. So Zen I think far from being, quote unquote, self-power in the sense of the self-powering itself to enlightenment, I think it can be better thought of as the active practice of learning to let go. I think, again, the notion of being acted upon by the side of the Buddha is in fact implied by the basic Mahayana teaching that enlightenment is possible only because we are in essence already enlightened. As Hakuin says, all sentient beings are essentially Buddhas. Mahayana Buddhist thought describes Buddha nature as an unconditioned creative consciousness that permeates all beings and even things, and that this unconditioned consciousness is a dynamic process that's always moving toward manifestation in sentient beings. The best expression that I've read of this is in a few articles by the great Buddhist scholar Marco Pallis, of a previous generation. He argued for this brilliantly, I think, in an article, "Is There Room for Grace in Buddhism?" I was intending to read a passage from this, which I thought really summed it up. But unfortunately, Marco Pallis is so brilliant that he expresses his ideas in print in a way that is perfectly clear, but in sentences that, while entirely logical, become so complex that they're almost impossible to understand when they're just read. So I encourage anyone who's interested in this subject in particular to read the article. It is in a book called A Buddhist Spectrum. And also it's available, Is There Room for Grace in Buddhism? I have found it online, so it should be findable online. But to summarize what his main point, he says that the path of enlightenment is essentially a dynamic that takes place between two poles, the pole of the human and the pole of the transcendent. The movement of this dynamic is always in the direction of the transcendent toward the human. Since the human side, with our minds limited by conditioned thought, can't possibly access the transcendent. He says, it's obvious to anyone who thinks that ignorance cannot access wisdom. It has to be initiated from the side of the transcendent. Marco Pallis quotes a passage from the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, which I thought was a good summing up of it. Meister Eckhart said, "In the course of nature, it is really the higher which is ever more ready to pour out its power into the lower than the lower is ready to receive this power. For there is no dearth of God with us. What dearth there is wholly ours, who make not ready to receive God's grace." And Pallas adds, where Eckhart says God, you have but to say enlightenment, and the result will be a Buddhist statement in form as well as in content. Well, what Buddhist is describing, of course, is the action of grace, the unconditioned striving to manifest itself in the limited, conditioned mind. This, I think, is central to understanding the nature of the path of awakening. As Marco Pallis says, the limited, conditioned mind of samsara cannot possibly comprehend the limitless, unconditioned mind of enlightenment. So the path of enlightenment can only be, in essence, an activity from the side of enlightenment. I think a greater emphasis in Zen on this concept of grace, of being acted upon by the side of the Buddha, as Dogen put it, might help clarify that Zazen is a practice not of forcing the mind into extraordinary states, but doing our part to allow our intrinsic Buddha nature to manifest itself. I once heard the Trappist, the abbot of a Trappist monastery who was very interested in the practice of Zen meditation. He summed it up as, meditation is the art of learning to get out of God's way. This reminds me a bit of the problem I had as a young Catholic with the notion of faith. The Zen writer Alan Watts, who I think has much more to say than a lot of people tend to give him credit for nowadays, but he had something very interesting to say about the matter of faith as opposed to belief. He said, belief, as I use the word here, is the insistence that the truth is what one would wish it to be. Faith, on the other hand, is an unreserved opening of the mind to the truth, whatever the truth may turn out to be. Faith has no preconditions. It is a plunge into the unknown. Belief clings, but faith lets go. In this sense, again, I think Zen meditation can be seen as a training in faith. I think that the concept of grace can also help in dealing with a certain aspect of suffering that often arises in the course of spiritual practice. Several times I've had people, visit me, people primarily at Sogenji in Okayama and under Harada Shodo Roshi. And they've said to me something to the effect of, I just can't understand it. I've been doing Zen for years now, and somehow after every week retreat, I'm like depressed for 2 or 3 weeks. It's as though, part of the problem, I think, is a misconception about what the resolution of suffering means. The thinking seems to be that, since what Buddhism is about is the resolution of the problem of suffering, well, then if you begin your Zen practice with X amount of suffering, after a year you should have X amount of suffering minus 1 year of Buddhist practice. And after 2 years, you should have X amount of suffering minus 2 years of meditation, et cetera, et cetera. But what actually often ends up happening is that once the initial enthusiasm for the practice wears off, an even greater sense of suffering and meaningless sets in. And I think to some extent this is natural. I see this occurring in sort of 2 stages. I think, such suffering is only natural at some point in the beginning, because ordinarily, we invest a good bit of time and our energy to distracting ourselves from the worries and sorrows of everyday life. But this approach no longer works so well when, with meditation, we set aside the distractions and start observing the mind just as it is. This, of course, it makes us more clearly aware of the sufferings that have already been there, always been there. And this kind of realization, I think, is to be encouraged. If we want to attain genuine transformative growth, we have to work with the reality of our minds, not our illusions about who we are. Beyond this, though, however, there is a deeper, kind of a more existential form of suffering that emerges with longer practice, something known in Christianity as the dark night of the soul. When this later form of, I think, practice-related suffering occurs, the Zen practitioner is usually told just to keep sitting, rely on the meditative technique. Now, this approach, just sitting, I think this, actually can be productive for a certain type of strong-willed personality. But for many people I've seen, such suffering is very confusing. And it leaves them feeling that their practice has failed. A lot of people I know have quit the practice because of this. I think it's precisely because the techniques of meditation in Zen have been so highly developed that Zen hasn't had to really examine the psychological processes behind this kind of deeper suffering that can arise during the course of practice. The techniques alone, often enough, are sufficient to get a person through these crises. But conversely, Christianity, again, precisely because its methods of meditation are not as developed, often, I think, as those in Buddhism. This has forced Christianity to examine the psychology of this kind of suffering and recognize its importance in the purification of the mind. St. John of the Cross, one of the greatest writers on the path of prayer, he likens this purification process to fire burning wood, which starts off with, a lot of smoke and crackling and sparks flying here and there. Similarly, he says, the spiritual purification process starts with much discomfort for the spirit. But just as wood finally turns to brightly glowing coals, the purified spirit is peaceful and luminous with the light of God. And St. John lays out a map of the process, which informs the practicer of what to expect on the path and sensitizes him or her to the benefits it brings. Very interesting also to me, particularly as a Zen practicer, was what another Christian mystic, the author of the text The Cloud of Unknowing, had to say. He describes the significance of this kind of suffering in a way that brings to mind, this Mahayana concept of Buddha nature as a dynamic process that seeks to manifest itself in sentient beings. The Cloud of Unknowing says that the deepest form of spiritual suffering is the self's consciousness of its own existence, self being the thinking self in this case. As Buddhism and modern psychology tells us, the ego self is basically a thought construct. And thought, being based on past experience, is always conditioned and thus has no access to that which is unconditioned. I thought the Cloud of Unknowing expressed this pretty well. He said, God can well be loved, but God cannot be thought. By love, God can be grasped and held, but by thought, neither grasped nor held. So in all the mystical traditions, thought is identified as the cause of the subtlest and most profound form of unease or dissatisfaction. That thought cannot approach God is the source of this suffering that is closest to the essence of our spirit. Yet Christian mystical theology tells us that it is precisely this suffering that finally drives us to transcend the limits of thought. A number of longtime Zen practitioners that have talked to me, about this kind of confusion that they were going through, I've lent them Christian texts on prayer, like The Cloud of Unknowing seems to be particularly liked by Zen practitioners. But it's helped them. They've commented to me later that these texts really helped them make sense of this kind of frustration and confusion that they were experiencing with the meditative practice. One of the most helpful is actually, I'm not familiar by far with the entire range of literature on this subject, but one that I personally came across and found very interesting was a trilogy of short, almost like novels by the writer David Torkington. These are called The Hermit, The Prophet, and The Mystic. All of them, they're only about 100 pages, and sort of, as I said, sort of in novel style, so they're quite accessible. Okay, the final point I would like to make does not really concern doctrine or technique, but is rather more a matter of description. It's interesting that Buddhism speaks a lot about the goal of the path of practice as nirvana or Buddhahood, but it doesn't really try to describe what such a state might actually be like. Now, quite understandably, words cannot possibly describe it. But the Christian mystics, for all their talk about, the dark night of the soul and all the suffering we have to go through, they seem more willing, to take a stab at describing the joy that is related to union with the divine. Meister Eckhart, in particular, he had a very nice description of it that reminds me of the Buddhist notion of the samadhi of play. what Eckhart says is, I have often said that there is something in the soul that is so closely related to God that it is one with God and not just unified with God. Now all things are alike in God and are God. Here in this sameness, God finds it so pleasant that God lets his nature and his being flow in this sameness. It is just as enjoyable for God as when someone lets a horse run loose on a meadow that is completely level and smooth. Such is the horse's nature that it pours itself out with all its might in running about the meadow. This it would find delightful, for such is its nature. So too does God find delight and satisfaction where God finds sameness. God finds it a joy to pour his nature and being completely into the sameness, for God is this sameness. Well, my time is up, so perhaps on this upbeat note, I should bring this talk to an end. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, John. That was a wonderful talk. Wonderful talk. I would like to ask for questions from the floor or from online, actually.
Yes. There's one question online, from online. Can you comment or contrast Christian Buddhist approach to guilt and remorse?
Yeah, the members of the London Buddhist Society asked questions that could form the center of my impression of what Buddhism has to say on the question of guilt is in large part formed by my experience with Japanese Buddhism. And as anthropologists often say, Buddhism, Japanese culture is a shame culture. It's not a guilt culture. And this has, greatly shaped the way that the Japanese deal with ethical questions, for example. I think, of course, there are feelings that just are not labeled as guilt, but constitute guilt. A lot of Japanese, particularly in the earlier years, when I was, in Japan in the 1970s, 1980s, when a lot of Japanese had experienced World War II. A lot of the men I met had actually been in the Japanese army and felt tremendous shame about what the Japanese army had done in the other countries of Asia. And in point of fact, the Zen monasteries after World War II were filled with ex-soldiers who were trying to come to some terms with their experiences in the war. Tenryuji, which is, it's an average-sized monastery that is made to house train perhaps 30 people. There was over 70 monks there. I don't know where they slept. It's amazing, but at any rate, they were trying to deal with what I would only be able to characterize as a kind of guilt. Me personally, having been raised a Catholic, of course, I'm familiar with the old saying, what's the difference between the Catholics and the Anglicans? What in America, the Episcopalian Church, the Anglicans. The Anglicans are Catholicism without guilt. I don't know if I would say that, but it is particularly emphasized in in the Catholic Church, particularly in the American Catholic Church in the time I was growing up. I think, when all is said and done, when I look back on my own spiritual path, guilt was actually ended up being a rather positive quality for me. It does make you think about what and why you have done things. And as my younger brother, who spent many years in New York, once said, Tom, the problems we're facing today in America are not caused by people who feel an excess of guilt. It can be, depending on how you use it, a quite useful quality. So it's not one, though, that I've devoted a tremendous amount of thought to. So I don't know if I can answer the question adequately, but anyway, that's what I have to offer.
All right, there's another one. What is Buddhism view on anxiety and fear? What is Buddhist view on anxiety and fear?
Anxiety and fear. Well, of course, this is caused by entanglement with self-identification as thought system. Again, this point that I've made in both talks, that what we identify as being what we are, what we identify as self, important though this identity is basically, according to Buddhism and according to psychology, nothing more than a thought construct. And this thought construct is generally at the basis of our anxiety and fear. Threats to our self-identity, threats to the narrative that is basically what the ego is, according to psychology. So Buddhism would regard these as other expressions of delusion, a false notion of the true nature of reality and what the human self is. Of course, it's quite natural to feel fear if a lion is charging at you, or if you're in a dangerous situation. But fear and anxiety, where it becomes a problem, is often in the rehashing, not in the experience itself. And it is in the rehashing and the going over and the recalling of that time someone insulted me and what I should, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and all of this stuff that is involved with I was so right and they are so wrong. And protecting the ego, basically. This is what leaves its groove in the psyche, in the ego sense, and expresses itself as fear and anxiety, I think, often. So Buddhism sees, yes, the realization of the true nature of self and reality as the best antidote to dealing with the sort of everyday anxiety and fear that we feel.
Next question is, when you say purification of suffering, does that mean suffering is impure? Please elaborate on what you mean by purification.
Purification, again, in this context, what is it that drives us to want to transform ourselves into, say, better people or more understanding people? It's almost always suffering. I mean, people who are happy and satisfied with the way they are and the nature of life, their life as it is, are not terribly motivated to start addressing fundamental issues in their own personality and what exactly is causing the problems I feel, et cetera, So the role, the connection between suffering and purification is that suffering is what motivates a person to start looking beyond their own identity, to start searching for the nature of their identity beyond the level of just a thought construct. So for that reason, Hakuin Zenji, the great Zen master, talks about the Jumoku Daibosatsu, hell, the great bodhisattva, because he himself went through a tremendous amount of suffering as a young person, and this is precisely what motivated him to make the effort to all of the effort involved in the meditative search. Okay.
There's no more question. Thank you.
Okay. You're like a Japanese audience. Nobody asks a question. Okay. Yeah.
You have one there?
Thank you very much, Sensei. I really enjoyed that, especially the discussion about grace. I thought that was just so rich. My question really is around the concept of creation, because in Christianity, grace kind of makes sense in terms of the world being created by the divine. And I just wondered, that from what I know of Zen, which might not be very much, but that there isn't a concept of creation as such. So how does grace work when there's no concept of creation?
Well, this gets into like theological, Buddhist theological, not theological, but doctrinal issues that a lot of people are much more competent than me to explain. But basically, Buddhism is an outgrowth of Indian spirituality. And Indian spirituality, certainly the strains of Indian spirituality that most influenced Zen, Buddhism as a whole, had no concept of a single creation event. It's a cycle. It's this endless cycle. There's the joke about someone asked the holy man, well, what is supporting the world? It's a turtle. Well, what's supporting the turtle? Another turtle. Well, what's under that? The sage finally says in frustration, it's turtles all the way down. So there's this kind of concept of, these immeasurably vast temporal periods known as kalpas, and that going in cycles of creation and stability and degeneration and disappearance. And then this will set off another cycle, and it's this endless cycle. It's just the way the kind of universe works. And I think, again, that there has been this idea in Indian spirituality, I think, pretty much from the start, as creation being a process that did not occur in time, but is always occurring right now. The creation is an ongoing process. I think even in Christianity, there's a strain of theology that has that. I believe it's called process theology. So that creation, it doesn't really make sense to talk of a creation in this endless cycle of one kalpa leading to another. And, creation has been just going on constantly in the timeless present. So by reconnecting with this timeless present, basically, it's not, particularly when you start comparing Mahayana ideas with some of the older Theravada ideas, Mahayana wants to develop certain concepts in ways that they weren't really developed in Theravada. For example, the notion of anatman, non-self. Buddhism rejects the notion of atman, which is a permanent self. And the idea being, we're just a combination, a construct of various different factors. But what they're really talking about, it seems to me, when they reject that notion of Atman, it is Atman as ego. You get into Mahayana Buddhism, especially into like the Nirvana Sutra, which is very sophisticated Buddhist thought. They say, oh no, what's real is the Atman, if you understand what Atman really is. And it's not suffering. What's really real is joy. And all of the four things that are said to contrast Buddhism, they just turn it on its head and said, when you really get to the core of things, it's self. I mean, it's a manifestation of the ultimate truth, which is Buddha nature. And Buddha nature is defined, you know, when you get into Tathagata Garbha thought, the Buddha realms, it's defined as imbuing everything that exists. It doesn't quite go, I'm not, again, familiar enough with the minutiae of the doctrinal theories here, but in some ways it seems like a creator God. But more the notion of a transcendent being almost that infuses everything. Even in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha talks about himself as always being present. I'm dying, but I will always be here. You know, and I just manifest at appropriate times, you know, to help people find liberation. So, is that a?
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I always think Tathagata Garbha thought is kind of an immanence of the divine rather than a transcendence, that the divine is inside everything.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Kind of imbues everything that exists is the way I understand it as being expressed certainly in the higher Mahayana literature. Yeah. Well, there's a.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I just wondered, as somebody who's published Untangling Vines and the Koan practice, which I don't think there's really anything similar in Christianity to a Koan practice. And I wondered if you could say to what extent that is still existing in Japan, and how important you think it is to the realization of enlightenment.
Okay, I'm afraid my hearing, I'm 75 now, my hearing is not what it was. What was it specifically that you were asking about?
It's about, I mean, you've published Entangling Vines,
yeah.
Yes, which is about Koan practice.
Right.
And I just wondered whether you could, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly similar in Christian practice to Koan practice. And I just wondered if you could just expand on your views about Koan practice and meditation.
Yeah.
And how those two go together and how important they are.
Yeah, actually that is a big topic I intend to talk about tomorrow. So I don't want to kind of shoot my wad. But it is a much more complex problem that I think, I mean, the koans themselves are complex problems in a certain sense, but the whole issue of koan practice as a method of liberation is quite complicated. And I would like to say certain things that I've just observed about it over the course of my decades in Japan. So if you'll excuse me, I'd like to leave that for tomorrow. Yeah, okay, sorry.
Sorry, I got two more questions here from online. Have you any tips on how to let go of thoughts?
Relaxation. If I had to sum it up in one word, thought almost, here again I make generalizations that could easily be challenged, but I think most thoughts involve a certain tension because they're thoughts about reality rather than a perception of reality itself. And so often they do, this default thinking that generates so much of the negative material in our mind that makes up the ego concept, just involves tensions, I think, resistance. Hakuin talks about this in one of his more very interesting works, the Yasen-kana, the night boat on a river. He in his practice, I mean, he was like a case study of maybe forced practice gone wrong because he became extremely ill, as he mentions. Some kind of nervous problem, perhaps. They're not really sure what sort of illness it was, but he turned to the practice of Taoist meditations, apparently for quite some time. And reading what he says about these meditations, it's very obvious that these were all sort of relaxation techniques that involved just what are basically Vipassana techniques of sensitivity to sensations in your body. He has this meditation, for example, where he imagines like an egg-shaped conglomeration of all the best medicines in Chinese, herbal medicine, or sort of like a lump of butter that you place on your head, and as it slowly melts down and imbues the body inside and outside, it flows down the body and melts away all of the pain and the illness and everything else, and it goes down, and you just keep repeating this, which I tried actually in the monastery, and it's basically just a very effective relaxation technique. Other techniques where he's lying down, he describes certain breathing methods. And he says that as a result of this, he not only got completely better from these terrible illnesses, which looked like they were going to kill him, but he said he found koan practice very, very much easier after that. So my own experience, in the beginning, early years of meditation, when you get into a work retreat and there's days when your mind is like running a mile a minute, it was often relaxation exercises like this that kind of naturally allowed the thoughts to just sort of settle down of their own. Now, there's other techniques, and I think it's worth kind of looking into them. Zen doesn't like techniques, but they can be quite useful. For example, if you find yourself, thinking all the time, one technique that I found to be quite interesting was you just make yourself aware of the thought that I'm thinking now, and then you repeat it, word for word. And then you sit there, okay, what's the next thought? And it'll come, but you just repeat that thought word for word. And you continue to do this, and it creates a kind of space between you and the thought. You become the observer. And this is really the key to going beyond this whole identification with thought, which is to observe thought, start noticing the times when the mind is naturally quiet as you observe it from your perspective as observer, and that the thoughts come out of that silence somehow. So that can go, what you're searching for, I think, is overcoming this identification of the thought process as defining who you are. Yeah, other than that, it's a matter of practice.
Okay. Next question is, are there any books you can suggest on this interplay of Christianity and Buddhism?
There's like a whole bookshelf or more of books on that. Of course, when I'm asked, it's hard to come up with a title, but I like, although again, people in the really orthodox traditions of like Rinzai Zen tend to dismiss traditions like the Sambo Kyodan, for example, which is a tradition of lay practitioners that originated in Japan, but has spread very much to the West. But it includes, for example, a lot of Christian clerics, monks and nuns and priests that have written a range of books. Ruben Habito, for example. This is one I would sort of like to look on my own bookshelf. And if the person is really interested in reading that, I'm having a hard time recalling anything specific, but there are a number of books that do deal with that. So would it be possible to make a list I could come up with available?
Oh, yes.
People
yeah.
are, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can provide that.
Yeah. Okay, please remind me to
Yeah,
send
we
that
can do
to
that.
you. Yeah.
Tyra, I know you have a question you'd like to ask. Is that right?
No question, impression.
Oh,
I am very excited today to have his talk.
no.
So,
Yeah.
but it's time is pressing. I'm afraid I can shortly. Can I say something?
Yes, please. This is for online, so the people online.
Tom-san, thank you very much. So, by hearing your talk today, some questions I have been holding since my arrival in London were brought to better solution, and I was very happy. The one of them is about Christianity. We had a wonderful interface dialogue between Christian and Buddhists here in this room, inviting former Bishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. We had a wonderful discussion, and toward the end of his talk, toward the end of the meeting, the Rowan said that we Christians need to be reminded of what was fundamental in early Christianity. So that his statement, so I was so surprised. So hearing your talk, what is fundamental in Christianity is now to some extent disappearing, but importance of meditation and emphasis on the here and now, and concept of grace, and those things. So very, very, so behind the, how can I say, behind the phenomenon of Christianity, it's underlies in this, it's rise in this tradition, in Western tradition. I was very pleased to have your talk today, and this solves my questions. Another question. I have been practicing Buddhism in this country for the last 30 years. But many of them are actually the children of the devout parents, their devout parents. Devout means Anglican Church or Catholic tradition. They are Christians. Their parents are Christians. Why? So, such a wonderful Dharma friends I have from Christian families. Now your talk gave me the answers. So under this tradition, behind the tradition of Christianity, so appreciation of the, as I said, the evaluation of the here and now, and meditation, and the grace, concept of grace. And so I understand why they're, so when they become a Christian friend, my friend from Christian tradition, so when their parents are Christian, and this person is a Buddhist, and he has some problem, and I say to them, go back to your parents. What you are received from your parents, extremely important. You become aware of what has been done by your parents or Christian tradition. It's very important. What is fundamental is most fundamental, is beyond the difference between religion, Christianity and Buddhism. The fundamental truth, both, so oneness, I think, oneness, suchness or oneness. So finally, I would like to tell you my gratitude. Your quotation from a Christian mystic. You said, it is this suffering that finally drives us to transcend the limits of thought. That is wonderful statement. And it reminds me of D.T. Suzuki's statement. Toward the very end of his life, he left this note when he translated Shinran's Kyogyo Shinsho. He said, the very fact of this precious activity, creation means blind passion, the suffering, this very fact of precious activity makes us long for something beyond us, comma, which is actually within us. It's a so profound statement. So I like Rinzai very much, and so if you have sufferings and if you seek for your solution up there, connecting yourself something up there, no solution at all. So here is my friend, young friend, Goshin. So he is my master's grandson. Then my master had three brothers, and the youngest one attended the assault retreat. We call it the summer training assembly. This boy, when he was 10 years old, came back to his father, Tokyo, and he asked his father, very challenging, do you know where Buddha is coming? From where Buddha is coming? Then this father is a very devout Shin Buddhist, but he was a little bit careful. How do you think? He asked back. And this little boy said, it's coming from the bottom. Buddha is coming from the bottom. So that is a very profound answer. D.T. Suk said, the very fact of the creature's activity makes us long for something beyond us, which is actually inside us. So when you would like to seek the truth of life, please meditate or introspect. Turn inside. That is the most important thing for us. Thank you.
Just one sort of comment, a very obvious one really, is that our culture, was dominated by Christian iconography, wasn't it? So wherever you went, there was a crucifix. And you can't imagine a more vivid picture of suffering than a crucifix. somebody nailed to a cross, dripping in blood, with a crown of thorns and blood pouring down their face, with a wound in the side. I mean, it's horrific, isn't it? And that was a central cultural icon that kept Europe together and kept it going for 1,000 years. Nowadays, our cultural icon is someone standing eating a hamburger, because if you suffer, you failed in our cultural values. You have failed. Instead of suffering being the road to liberation, to freedom, it's actually an indication of your failure. And that creates in my opinion anyway, a society that's intolerant of other suffering, that denies it. That's why there's such lack of compassion. Anyway, just a thought. But Tom, you gave a most wonderful talk. Thank you very, very much indeed. And also thank you all too online for your questions. And tomorrow we'll be going further and deeper into this fascinating question. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.